When my son was about 3 years old, we were living with my mom in an older apartment. I had always gotten a weird vibe from it. The atmosphere felt heavy and a little oppressive, but I assumed it was just because of the age. However, my son started waking up in the middle of the night and would talk to his friend, who he described as the Hat Man. He would always wake up and tell Hat Man that he didn't want to go play with him because he was supposed to be asleep and that he'd see him tomorrow. This was always followed by him waking me up and asking for a glass of water. I knew it wasn't just an imaginary friend when one night I heard him talking, and when he said he'd see him tomorrow, the door to his room closed on its own. This stopped completely once we moved out. One day, my daughter came home from preschool and told me she had a new friend that joined her classroom named Susha. I didn't think much about it. My daughter would say things like that she wanted a colorful backpack like Susha's or hair ribbons like hers. One day, my husband asked the teacher to point out which girl on the playground was Susha, and the teacher told him there was no such girl. After that, my husband insisted this was an imaginary friend and discouraged my daughter from mentioning her. It was several months before she brought Susha up again. We went on a trip to Argentina from California, and as we were riding up a glass elevator in the Buenos Aires airport, my daughter suddenly pointed down into the crowd and said, "Look, there's Susha. She followed us here, even though Dad told her to go away." Neither myself nor my husband saw a child where she was pointing. When my son was first learning to talk, he would tell us about something called Purple Mommy. He described Purple Mommy as all purple with long hair and bright, all-white eyes. At the time, he was mixing up purple with black a lot, so he could have meant she was all black and shadowy. Purple Mommy would pick him up at night and turn off the lights. This creeped me out, as we would often find my son out of his crib in the morning, which would mean him crawling over the railing and to the ground at a time when he was barely walking. I definitely found the lights in his room off a few times too, even though he's terrified of the dark. He also explained that Purple Mommy needed bandages because she had blood everywhere. Purple Mommy could take her head off. And finally, Purple Mommy really didn't like Daddy. He told us all of this stuff for maybe a year or a little more. If we ever asked where she was, he'd always point to the same spot, a corner of the room behind his open closet door. He woke up crying almost every night during this time. Once, during a really rough night, my wife went to ask him what's wrong, and his answer was, "Purple Mommy won't let me sleep." I had an imaginary friend named Derek who was a carbon copy of me. We were completely identical. I played with Derek for years, longer than what normal kids do. But he would always look at my mom and older sister with a sense of sadness. Eventually, he went away. 23 years later, I was digging through my mom's safe to grab some paperwork she'd kept for me, and I found a stillborn death certificate for a boy named Derek who shared my birthday. It was only then that I discovered I was actually a twin, and my brother Derek died during birth. When my son was 3 years old, one day he asked me what happened to the little boy he used to play with. I asked him who he was talking about, thinking he was referring to his cousins or friends from daycare. This happened in the year 2020, and those were basically the only kids he saw that year, so it had to be one of them. He said, "No, the little boy I play tag with in the backyard." Well, there had never been a little boy over in our yard at that time. I asked if he was thinking about a dream he had, and he was very adamant that there was, in fact, a boy he had played with multiple times in our yard. I was a little wigged out, but also was thinking, he's 3, so who knows? About a year later, we were driving to preschool, and he said quietly to me from the back of our minivan, "Mom, sometimes I see people who aren't there, that other people don't see." I asked what he meant and tried to get him to elaborate, but he went mum and didn't seem to want to talk about it anymore. He's now 6 and hasn't mentioned any of these friends again. Let's start with some backstory here. One of my uncles, let's call him Steve, lost a childhood friend when he was about 7 years old. Steve and his friend, let's call him Jack, were having a playdate one afternoon and got a bit dirty in some mud. So Steve's mother gave Jack a pair of Steve's shoes to borrow. When Jack's father came to pick him up after the playdate, he forgot to put his shoes back on, so he accidentally got into the car still wearing Steve's boots. Tragically, the father and Jack got into a terrible car crash on the way home, which killed 7-year-old Jack. The family had him buried in the shoes he had borrowed from Steve. Fast forward 30 years. It's 2010, and we were at a family gathering. My 6-year-old cousin Sarah was alone, playing with toys in a quieter room of the house. My Uncle Steve went up to her and asked her what she was playing. Sarah responded, saying that she was playing with a friend. Holding back a smile, Steve asked who her imaginary friend was. She explained that she was playing with his friend Jack, adding, "He's sorry he forgot to give your shoes back." My uncle's jaw nearly dropped. He had not talked about Jack in years, let alone told that story to a 6-year-old. No one had brought up Jack that day, nor at any family gathering recently. Every time I remember this incident, I get chills. My son stopped talking to his imaginary friend for months after my nephew, who was 15, took his own life. My son, who was not quite 5, was the apple of his eye. My nephew treated my son like a little brother, and since his mom watched my son while I worked, they spent tons of time together. I had simply told my son his cousin was sick from sadness, and he died. I would remind him every time before we went to their house, so he wouldn't pester my sister about where he was. One day he said, "Mom, you keep saying he's not here anymore, but he is. He sits on my bed before I go to sleep and talks to me." He would not be dissuaded. This went on for months. He knew things we did not speak about around him that happened. My nephew's grandpa on his dad's side passed a few months later. That's when my son told me his cousin told him he wouldn't be able to visit anymore. He was going on a train with his grandpa, and they couldn't come back again. Last thing he told him was to never play with guns. They weren't safe. My nephew took his life with a handgun. Wigged me the hell out. I was taking my 3-year-old niece for ice cream one evening. I strapped her into her car seat in the back seat. As I started driving, my niece asks if Jacob, her imaginary friend, could get an ice cream too. I jokingly said, "Jacob can get his own ice cream." I laughed and said, "Just kidding. We'll get Jacob an ice cream." She didn't respond, so I looked in the rear-view mirror. I couldn't see very much because it was dark. What I could see was my niece's face. She looked angry, and I was about to reassure her that I was kidding, but I realized she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at something near my ear, towards the back of my head. Then she says, "I said no, Jacob. Be nice. No, she didn't mean it." When I was little, it was pretty firmly established that I had an imaginary friend named Other. Other had the same name as me, so I just called him Other. I would tell my mom that Other was being mean to me and wants to steal Dad's bike. I remember I told my father that Other was very mad at him for hurting me. He was an abusive piece of work and he literally threw me across the room. I asked my mom about it as an adult, and she told me my father had a brother that I was named after and wasn't told about because shortly before I was born, he died in a motorcycle accident. When my daughter was 4 years old, she had 2 friends when we lived in a rental house. One was named Samantha. Samantha would insist on staying in my daughter's room most of time. Then my daughter would say that Samantha had to go to bed, and we asked where her bed was. She very nonchalantly told us, "She leaves the house when it gets dark and goes out the back door to sleep under the grass." We opted not to investigate further. The other was a man that she called monstrous, or something close to that. He was very nice, according to her, and had long black hair and wore tan pants and funny shoes with no shirt. She said he was usually covered in blue and white, and would come, walk around the house and the yard, hang around and listen to music if we had some on, and would stand in the front yard until morning. We've since moved out of that house, and she has not uttered one thing about either friend visiting.